Hello and welcome to Mann's Model Moments. Today I was going to be talking about the 1/48 scale Airfix Bristol Blenheim, but because of the fantastic reaction to last week's video on 10 beginner mistakes and how to remedy them, and you can click above if you've not seen that video yet, I thought it would be remiss of me not to follow up and start on the 1/72 scale Karo-AS Falke I made so flippantly last time as a demonstration of those errors. Before I start on that though, let me say a quick thank you to the hundreds of new subscribers on the channel over the last week. Because of all of you, I've just joined the YouTube Partner Program, which allows creators to monetize their channels, a great help as I'm not currently working at the moment. It also allows you to get super likes, super chats in live sessions and so on, so I'm very grateful to everyone to get me past that threshold. I do know that over 90% of you that watch these videos aren't subscribed, so if you feel I've earned that after you've watched today, please do subscribe and ensure notification bell is set to all so you don't miss any of these in the future. If you'd like to support me even more directly, I do also have a Patreon that has some other benefits, and there's a link for that in the video notes below. Now, because I really want to go through the steps on this model, I decided to split this into two videos, the build and the painting and finishing. I did this as there were some great comments on the last video, and I wanted to try to address some of them as we go through the build of the Falke this time. I put things here in a logical order rather than necessarily the order in which I did them, but it doesn't really have an impact on any of the build stages. Now there were some more negative comments on the video last time, and I just want to say straight up that I'm not trying to decry anyone's way of making kits here. What you do for your own enjoyment after all is up to you, and the number one rule in making any model is to have fun. That said, my content, as I said in my channel intro video, is really about being inspirational, motivational, and also achievable. It's not about my ego, I'm trying to motivate myself and help others with the experience I've gained along the way. All of those caveats aside, let's have a look at what I did. So the first thing we need to do is get the model as close to a starting state as possible. I did this by carefully disassembling the various sub-assemblies from the main body, things like tailplanes, props, undercarriage and so on, before removing the fuselage from the wings. I didn't go further than that as I couldn't do so without breaking some of the original pieces, so these all went into some totally awesome overnight. You can also use Dettol or something like brake fluid, but Totally Awesome gently removes the paint with some encouragement from an old toothbrush, leaving us more or less at the start once more. The starboard outer wing junction had a ridge of excess plastic from casting, so that needed to go. I carved this very carefully with my scalpel until it matched the chord of the rest of the wing. The next job was to set about evening the joins in the plastic. This is to ensure that the two sides of where the plastic meets is as even as possible, so we don't end up with a ridge that we end up filling on one side, giving an unrealistic ramp effect. I also filled the joins in the wings and engine cowlings with sprue goo and sanded them back. In order to check the finish and fill minor imperfections, the next step was to use some Mr. Surfacer 500. This is a lacquer-based filler suitable for light seams and evening out other work, and it's also good for showing what work you still need to do. It dries quickly and leaves a very uniform finish suitable for spotting areas to work on. On areas like these intakes on the engine cowlings, it's important to preserve the definition of their shape, either with your model knife or with a detail sanding stick. Otherwise, filler will build up in these areas and start to smooth everything out too much. We also need to open up the various intakes on the engine cowlings. These very small ones at the top are actually too small for my wow stick, so I've gone back to my pin vise and a very small bit. The other intakes are all suitable for the wow stick with a follow-up from the scalpel to ensure the correct shape. The oil radiators on the GMO 210s are very prominent and have nothing at all in them on the kit. I'm going to fix that with this hobby mesh by cutting out small sections which are a little too large and then bending the ends at 90 degrees to create this extended C profile. I then threaded very light fishing line into one end through the front and back out at the other end, meaning that we now have our mesh caught on a loop. This enables me to put the mesh in end first and then jiggle it about a bit so I can pull on the loop and have the correctly oriented mesh pull into place. Some superglue added at the edges secures the mesh in place, and the line can be pulled out by releasing one end and pulling on the other. Obviously this would all be easier if we were making the kit from scratch, but it's amazing what solutions you can find when there isn't that option. When designing the Falke, there wasn't enough room in the narrow cockpit for all the engine gauges, so in a similar manner to the later Henschel HS129, some of these were mounted on the engine cowlings facing inwards to the pilot. In order to depict these, I cut thin plasticard strips to size using the panel lines on the kit as a guide, marked out their position and the sizes of the gauges on one, and drilled them out. I then used the first complete one as a mask to make the second to ensure that they were both the same, and then glued them into place with Tamiya Extra Thin. As the main fuselage had come apart at the front, the first task was to clamp this and glue it together with Tamiya Extra Thin. When that was dry, I then removed the large lugs that we had inside the fuselage, and of course ignored last time. These are big enough to be cut off with snippers, with only a rough cleanup from our knife needed afterwards. Filling and sanding was next, which I achieved in the same way as the wings, with sprue goo, Mr. Surfacer 500, and a lot of sanding with 240 and 400 grit sanding sticks. We can then start dealing with a glaring external inaccuracy in this kit, and that is in the fairings and ports for the MG17 machine guns in the fuselage. The upper fairings are just about tolerable, though a little deep on the kit, but the lower ones are way bigger than the slight bulge at the rear and a rise at the port shown in the period photos, as the lower gun is more wholly encompassed by the fuselage. Here you can see I'm marking the lower port in permanent marker to show what I need to remove to make them more accurate, as well as how far the ports reach in their ingress into the fuselage. When I'm happy with that, I move on to carefully carving away the marked areas until I'm left with something close to that on the actual aircraft. The trick here is to be careful, removing small amounts of plastic at a time and gradually working towards the end result. This helps not to remove either too much plastic or parts of yourself, which is always possible when handling sharp hobby knives. Once that's done, it's time to get the drill out and create more realistic cutouts in the fuselage. This is done with first a small drill bit to make the pilot hole and ensure the direction is correct, before stepping up to the larger drill bit that I actually want for these ports. While I'm at it, I also do the same for the 20mm cannon ports in the wing roots. A quick cleanup with a sanding stick and we're ready to move on. So at the moment we have our main fuselage and wing assembly all prepared and ready, sanded and smooth and corrected. Before we go and join them up, there are a couple of important steps, the first of which is the cockpit. Now the stock kit comes with a cockpit floor and little else, so we need to start with seeing what we have to work with. In order to do that, I'm using some plastic which is solid at room temperature, mouldable after heating in boiling water, as you can see here. And I'm just squashing this into the main body of the aircraft, making sure I get it in good contact with the walls and canopy areas to get a good impression. It's a good idea to remove the hot water as soon as possible as well to stop scalding yourself. Getting the plastic back out isn't much of an issue since it does have quite a bit of flex in it. Now to create a more accurate cockpit, I'm using the pilot's armour panel as a reference, as we know where that lines up with on the canopy. I'm using that to mark the fuselage with a Sharpie. We also know that this armour comes up almost to the top of the canopy, so I'm sanding the edges of the kit part until I get the right fit to get that height. Now that we know the armour plate is the correct size, I'm using it to mark the depth on the moulded plastic and trimming it down to test fit back into the aircraft. That allows me to trim again at the canopy level and angle at the back, so when out, I can cut down the rear angle to give me a profile of what the rear panel should be. I'm then using that cut moulded piece to mark and cut out a piece from plasticard, leaving it a little long to allow for any errors, as it can always be clipped down in place. A little test fitting and sanding down gives me something that fits as the back wall to the cockpit and can be cemented in. Further to that, I'm adding sprue goo to the back of the piece to give it further strength. Now I am reusing the kit cockpit floor, but upside down and sanded to remove any glue residue. This actually fits pretty well, and once in, it's starting to look like the basis of a cockpit. I also strengthened the floor in the same way as the back, but taking care not to interfere with the wing joint. Next up is the rear parcel shelf, and to start off, the first job is to trim the rear cockpit wall so it's level. The shelf itself I just made by cutting a small piece of thin plasticard to rough shape, sanding and then gluing in position and trimming with a sharp blade. Once done, this was again strengthened from the rear with sprue goo. Now period references show the armour plate to be much thinner than represented in the kit, and with two very prominent ammo boxes on each side to feed the 4 MG17s. Starting with the armour plate, I simply made a replacement from thin plasticard to have a more scale appearance. And then I tackled the seats, which I replaced with etched brass items from a 1993 reheat set. Now this isn't really necessary, but I seemed to misplace one of the kit parts, and I happen to have these around, so it seemed appropriate. You can use the kit parts without any problem here, but the brass ones make up easily and a spot of superglue holds them in shape. Next are the very prominent MG17 ammo boxes. First I used the kit armour plate to mark how tall they should be, and then cut some simple squares from plasticard to reach that height. I clipped off the corners at an angle, and cut a groove in the centre to give the appearance of two symmetrical boxes. The boxes do have some prominent handles on the angled areas, so I made these by bending some 28 gauge wire around my tweezers, using the flat of my scalpel to ensure a tight bend. Now I made two sets of these boxes and cemented them together with a small space of a thin plasticard to give them the right separation. Then added these to the cockpit. Checking the fitment of the canopy wasn't affected before cementing. I made the bulkhead for the observer using plasticard and the kit armour panel as a template as before, but cutting the plasticard flush with the canopy rim. That done, I fixed the rear cockpit seat in place using superglue. Moving on to the pilot area, I added the remaining seat, but I wasn't too concerned about side consoles and so on since this isn't a super detailing project and little would be seen in the narrow cockpit through the canopy anyway. The next stage was painting the cockpit, but I'm not going to cover that here, but in part 2 of the video next week, which will cover all of the painting and finishing aspects of this kit. What I am going to cover is putting in the seatbelts. I think this step massively elevates any World War II model, and whilst a bit fiddly, it isn't expensive or particularly difficult. A tiny amount of superglue, fine tweezers and your hobby knife should get you through this. I always try to glue the belts on and then leave them to set in place before final positioning, particularly the lap belts. The last very prominent cockpit item that is missing in the kit is the gun sight. I just cut a small cube of plasticard and cemented that in place, and then superglued a tiny piece of thin clear plasticard to that at an angle. Very simple, but quite effective. Next up are all the extra bits, and I'm starting here with some of the worst offenders by removing seam lines by scraping with my scalpel. Sink marks were filled with sprue goo, and once dry, this was trimmed down with a scalpel and sanded. The undercarriage to wheel join is really flimsy on this kit, and it's not helped by the huge sink marks in the wheels. To remedy this, I made axles from fine pins. These are just 0.65mm in diameter, but still uncomfortably close to the width of the struts, so I needed to use my pin vise with a 0.4mm bit to make pilot holes through the undercarriage struts before then making the 0.65mm holes. Had I used a wow stick, I'd have probably gone through the side of the landing gear. Once done, the pin can be slid through and the ends trimmed with a pair of wire cutters. Just be careful you don't end up firing these pieces into your eyes or somewhere where they're going to hurt someone. I drilled out the wheels in a similar manner and cleaned them up using the scalpel as with the other items. If I was super detailing, I'd have probably replaced these completely, but again, this is about showing what you can achieve with mostly using the standard kit parts. Attaching the wheels is just a matter of sliding the new axle through the drilled hole and then securing the axle with a bit of super glue. At this stage I'm not fixing the wheels in place, as I'll do that when the undercarriage is on so I get the correct placement of the mudguards. When I was making the Falke for the video last week, I ended up knocking off the tailplanes a number of times during construction, and these are just butt joints. To prevent that happening this time, I decided to add pins to make them a bit more robust. I measured where to put them so I could be accurate on both sides, and marked them with a Sharpie. Unlike the landing gear, I could use my smallest wow stick bit here as there's plenty of material, but it's important to be accurate to avoid misalignment. The pins can then be superglued in place and trimmed, and this is a good time to also sand any mould lines and marks on the stabiliser itself. I then marked the fuselage with the same measured distances, made some small key marks with my scalpel to stop the wow stick bit skidding, and then drilled out these holes. I used contactor cement here for a really solid bond, knowing the pins would support them whilst drying. Having thinned out the trailing edge joins where needed, I cemented the wing and fuselage assemblies together and clamped them to give good contact at the rear to ensure it was as smooth and tight as possible without affecting the front join. When that was dry, the prominent gap around the join was filled with sprue goo and left to cure. Now last time I just used the basically translucent kit canopy and hand painted it. Someone mentioned in the comments about fogging due to plastic cement, but that's actually not the case. This is actually how the kit item comes. To remedy this, I'm starting here with an 800 grit sanding stick before moving on to a 3000 grit. Ideally you'd go through 1200 and 2000 first, but I don't want to spend too much time here. Metal polish is next, residue washed off, and then final buffing with 12,000 grit pads. This makes the canopy at least transparent, though again I'd ideally use the vac form item instead. The final piece to make the canopy decent is to give it a coat of pledge with clear and let it dry. I did the same process with the lower observation window and it actually came out pretty nicely. Next up, I cemented the canopy in place using Tamiya Extra Thin and clamped it to give a nice strong bond, which would be needed as there is some filling and sanding needed at the front of the canopy. I did the same with the lower observation window, and we are getting close to being able to paint this aircraft. The last pieces here were to sand the wing to fuselage join, and then use Mr. Surfacer and more sanding to make everything ready to paint. You've seen me sand enough today, so I'll spare you that, the only difference being in that I masked the transparencies with Tamiya tape to prevent any damage to them, while sanding. Once all that was done, I gave everything a coat of white primer, which is how you can see the plane here. As you can see, she's not perfect, but that's not the point of this. It's about creating a better model and working towards what you're capable of. That's all for this instalment of Mann's Model Moments. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel for more like it, and share this video with others you think would also enjoy it. You can also follow me on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook, and if you're feeling generous, then I also have a Patreon, which is absolutely the best way of helping me to grow the channel and produce more content like this. With that, I hope you have plenty of modelling moments of your own, and I look forward to welcoming you on the next video.